Over the past 2 weeks, I've been working hard to finish this asbestos mine level for my platforming game. And while I was happy with the overall visual style, it really bugged me that individual subsections didn't appear as distinct visually as they were mechanically. Just look at these areas, that look practically identical, despite appearing all around the map. In the past, I've tried to address this by making completely unique tile sets, but I felt that making new tile sets for every single area would require an absurd amount of effort, and could risk making areas differ too much from the fundamental visual style. So essentially, I had to solve this problem. How can I make an area look unique and interesting while remaining visually cohesive with the rest of the level? And to explain what I found, I first want to discuss these guys, the lanterns. By the release of the last devlog, after countless revisions, I was almost happy with how they looked, but something was still wrong. I only realized what it was when I looked at the bigger picture. Literally, the part of the lanterns that overlay the orange glow was so large that it effectively washed out the whole screen, reducing contrast and color range. Naturally, it would make sense to make this glow smaller, but then too much of the screen would be dark. The best solution I found was to decouple darkness and color. So the lantern had a larger radius where it removes darkness, and a smaller radius where it adds color. I think the lanterns now look really atmospheric and enhance the surrounding visuals. Since I was already working on the lighting, I also decided to modify these bombs, which glow for some reason. I suppose I thought it would look cool to have a dark area illuminated by moving objects, but in practice it just looks really distracting. Instead, I made the bombs only glow when they explode, and I added more lanterns to compensate for the increased darkness. At this point, I was very happy with how the first two subsections were looking and playing, so I thought it was appropriate to move on to the next two. The problem was, I couldn't work on the visuals yet because I hadn't fully sorted out their gameplay. And by that I mean the gameplay was bad and unorganized. In one subsection, the player is introduced to trapdoors, barbed wire, nail guns, levers that extend platforms, rock lumps under falling rocks, and miners throwing pickaxes at them near more barbed wire. There's literally not enough room in the area to expand on any of those mechanics. It's truly horrifying. The other subsection is not as bad, but still messy. Like I've done before, I decided to fix these areas by choosing a small set of ideas to focus on and develop. In the first one, I picked falling rocks combined with bombers and miners. It's worth noting that the bombers and miners were already introduced at this point, so they don't have to be demonstrated to the player here. Starting from the beginning, you're introduced to the falling rocks and have to navigate over some pillars without getting hit. Then you have to pass an inconveniently placed bomber. Next, you have to fight a miner while standing close to falling rocks. The falling rocks are directly in the way of attacking and dodging the attacks of the miner, so this makes for an engaging challenge. You then have to traverse some precarious platforms before dodging some falling rocks on those very platforms. You also fight another miner before heading into the final hallway. Here there's some bombers and falling rocks in a really tight area, requiring plenty of precise movements before reaching the finish. In the other subsection, I decided to focus on barbed wire and bats. First, a bat approaches you in a safe environment, where you can either dodge it or attack it. You then encounter a bat in a slightly more dangerous environment. The following area introduces barbed wire that must be jumped over or navigated under in increasingly difficult ways. This jump is actually deceptively difficult because you want to curve your jump around it. A bat then approaches you very close to the barbed wire, and then you reach the final area. This is a very dense clump of barbed wire that requires even more precise platforming. A bat is also thrown in the middle for good measure before you reach the exit tunnel. A final bat chases you, and you can choose to turn back and attack it, or run away from it. Overall, there's a pretty good difficulty progression here that I'm quite happy with. Now that I finished the gameplay, I was able to implement the visual designs you can see now. I decided to adopt a different strategy from before. So rather than just making an area look as different as possible, I tried to think about what type of setting each subsection inhabits, and how that would influence its appearance. The first subsection was on the edge of a cliff, so I sort of imagined it as being less maintained and occupied by the people who used to be here. To me, that meant the metal sheet walls would tear unevenly, with metal bars clearly exposed and random objects strewn about. It's still a part of the same compound, however, so the sheet metal tile set would be the same from the previous areas. In the other subsection, since you enter it through a downward tunnel, I imagined it would be some kind of maintenance area. Because of my work on the lanterns earlier, I was inspired to add a new type of light that emits this dim red color. One detail about changing the lighting is that it also changes the color palette, which is an easy way to change the look of everything. Like before, I reused the sheet metal tiles, though I experimented with arranging them differently. Here, putting them in a grid rather than offsetting them each row. I was planning on stopping there, but the background seemed barren, so I decided to add new wire tiles. These are actually thematically appropriate to a maintenance area, so everything works together quite well. There's also the giant yellow wires, which sort of encompass their own region, but they're still definitely an interesting way to move to the next area. I'm very happy with how these designs turned out, because they essentially do everything I need them to. They look like they're clearly related, but they each have their own accents that give them a distinct atmosphere. I learned a few things from this experience. Mainly that a good way to solve that problem I brought up at the beginning of the devlog is to use a mix of new and old visuals, and to determine the new visuals based on how the area fits into the context of the level as a whole. Second, that sometimes all it takes to make a more interesting background is just to break up a repeating pattern by injecting different tiles or even overlaying unique sprites. And third, that unique lighting can be used to dramatically change the mood of areas that would otherwise appear very similar. That's essentially the major task I accomplished this session, but that's not to say I didn't do anything else. I'm almost finished this level, so I'm also in the process of making everything polished. Most notably, I completely changed the rock lump enemy. Where it previously lunged at you at random speeds, it now moves towards you at a consistently fast speed. This further encourages the player to jump over it to dodge attacks, and makes it more predictable to reduce unfair hits. I also changed its appearance so that it fits with the setting better and is also taller, so you don't have to aim down to attack it. I also extended the first subsection to give more of an opportunity to fight these enemies. Based on a suggestion, I also decided to change the flame bubbles that you have to dodge later in the level, to be these asbestos puffs that seem to fit better with the setting. I also added this brief trapdoor drop that shows you how trapdoors work before you have to dodge the asbestos puffs on them. Lastly, I modified the subsection after to be entirely focused on nail guns, which didn't take much work and just meant adding a couple of new challenges at the beginning and end. And with that, I am so very close to finishing this level. All that's left is adding a few more visuals, sound effects, music, and the boss battle. So thankfully, I can say with certainty that the next devlog will be focused on an entirely new level. I've already thought of some ideas for it, and I'm excited to start implementing them. Otherwise, that's all for now, and if you'd like to keep up with future updates when they're released, please consider subscribing. Thank you. Bye.